Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we're going to be discussing how to conduct an influence operations investigation. We're going to be getting into the weeds and discussing some technical concepts, some frameworks, some best practice, what's coming up in the future, and unpacking all of that. And Ari today, Ari Ben Am, is our guest who's going to be talking us through that. He's an open source investigator and really knows this area as an analyst, as someone who served on the front line. So he's been an analyst at Cobwebs and Active Fence, and he's now the founder and CEO of Glowstick, which supports organizations and their intelligence teams with the processes and tools to conduct better analysis using OSINT and WEBINT techniques. The areas that interest him most include China, extremism, influence operations, and threat intelligence. So we're going to dive straight into the topic, and it should be a good one. Let's begin. Hey, Ari, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Rafi. Thank you. How are you? Pleasure to be here.
Really good. I'm doing well today, and great to have you on the show. We've got a lot to cover, and a lot of things that I think our listeners who maybe have listened to a few other episodes will be introduced to in terms of the specifics of the best practice of what you do and what you've done as an analyst. Before we get into that topic, I have to ask you what your first ever social media platform was.
This one will be a bit of a deep cut, but I imagine that at least for the target audience that I'm trying to appeal to in this podcast, it'll make a lot of sense. I'd have to say the Elder Scrolls forum. For those of you who played the Elder Scrolls, I started playing Morrowind when I was a kid. I don't know, maybe 7, 8 years old, and immediately started looking for sources for mods and other information online. So it's probably the Elder Scrolls forums. Also, I believe my first forum leak, believe it or not.
Okay, so you're going to have to explain it. You're going to have to explain a little bit more. Elder Scrolls, what is that for those that haven't come across that before?
For those that aren't aware of the Elder Scrolls, and I'm sure that many of you aren't, it is one of the most famous and best-selling, whatever you want to call it, open world RPG video game series ever created. So if you haven't heard of the Elder Scrolls, you probably heard of Skyrim, perhaps, which is a massive video game released, I think, at this point, 10 years ago or so. So for people like myself who are very into video game and online culture, it's a big deal.
We're going to be discussing investigations, influence operations investigations, and there's a lot that is included within that. But maybe let's start from the beginning for people that might not know what an influence operations investigation or what an analyst will be doing as part of that investigation. Explain it to us. Explain it to the audience. What does that involve? What is it?
Of course. So analog information operations, if we refer to them as analog or prior to the digital age, whatever you want to call them, have been around for arguably forever, right? Since the dawn of mankind, the act of deception, forgeries, lying, sharing false information, that sort of thing, usually done at a smaller scale. We've all heard of it. Kind of reached ahead in many ways in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Controlled all articles being taken out in newspapers, controlled being in this case meaning the author being paid to promote a certain viewpoint. The spread of forgeries. We can get into historic examples. The Soviets, for example, promoted many forgeries about HIV in America. The Olympic Games, trying to sow discord and so on, whatever happened to be back in the day. But that was done in an analog fashion. Someone was sitting down, writing these articles, forwarding these documents, and then sending them into the New York Times or other outlets, hoping they get picked up, whatever it happens to be, or simply mailing them across the house to houses of many people. Has been done, for example, with racial relations in America, people impersonating members of the KKK, and so on. That was the old era. Ever since the advent of the internet, things have changed, of course, rapidly, as all of our lives have in the past 20 or so years, since it's really gone mainstream with home internet connections. And that was, double-fold with the rise of social media, which I think could be arguably stated to be the single most important innovation, if you will, in the digital age, where now what required once people sitting in a room forging documents to spread them manually can now be done online much more easily and effectively. And people can exploit, to that degree, mainstream media platforms to promote that. In many ways, it's similar, I would say, even by the way, to the world of cyber warfare, where commercial infrastructure is often exploited by nation-state actors to carry out hacking attacks and so on.
Okay, and so that's what's being conducted by bad actors, malicious actors. And so if you're an analyst investigating that, how do you begin, or what's even the right way of thinking about it?
Well, I should even say before I even take a step further into how to actually investigate what the end goal truly is in this case. The end goal being to either win hearts and I get carried away by the technical stuff. What can I say? That's kind of my whole thing, if you will. What I prefer to focus on.
That's why you're on. That's why you're here.
Some people prefer the psychology and the narratives and so on, and that's fine and that's great, and I respect and appreciate it. But I have my own niche here. The goal being to either win hearts and minds in some cases, I would say arguably misguided cases, to sow discord, as has commonly been discussed, primarily in the case of, say, Russia, to promote certain talking points, whether it happens to be. And in the case of China, say to win even discourse power, to be taken seriously and to kind of flood the zone or flood the internet with wider talking points, to guide wider public opinion on certain topics or even on the very specific topics as well. It's also done, of course, as part of warfare, for example, in the part of wider deception to make the opponent think that you're going to be doing X when in reality you're going to be doing Y. There's a very broad spectrum here of activity, be it from soft persuasion to really hard disinformation meant to influence decisions and actions. Now, nice. What was that next question, Rafi, please?
Yeah, so you've gone through, that's fantastic. You've really gone through and explained the kind of historic and also modern day techniques and activities and the motivations as well, and the groups, right? State actors, it might be individual groups, it might be organized groups, it might be corporations, etc. And so if you are the analyst on behalf of any of those entities, and you are looking to conduct these investigations, how do you even begin? How do you think of the framework of carrying out an influence operations investigation in order to identify and uncover, the wider activities?
Rafi, that's a great question, and in my opinion, arguably the most important question, and perhaps the single most important vulnerability or issue that I find in investigation of IO nowadays. We tend to focus on pieces of content, and I say we, I mean the wider industry, not necessarily myself or anybody else in particular, right? We tend to focus on individual pieces of content that we check and verify and fact check, and then see where they've spread and so on. But the way that we access or find those pieces of content is done by usually coming up with a list of keywords and searching them. Now, the problem with that is that it's inherently limiting. When we are trying to think, what would Iran or China be trying to promote at any given point in time, right? We're limiting ourselves to what we think they'd be doing, when in reality, we should be letting the threat actor or individual tell us what they plan on doing as well. So I would say the single most important thing to begin with is to begin investing in having a passive monitoring array, mechanism, system, whatever you want to call it, right? Covering a variety of platforms, covering vetted disinformation entities, right? For example, in my opinion, that's the best thing you can do is to find a few quality entities affiliated with your threat actors that you're interested in and simply follow them, see what they say, and then pivot on what they happen to be trying to promote at any given point in time. And then hopefully you can catch it even earlier up in the chain as well.
I presume the thinking is that content is what is being created, but before the content comes, you actually have individuals or groups or impersonation accounts or whatever it is that are being created and are being put out there in the field, right? So the content kind of comes second.
Definitely. Similar to the MITRE attack chain in the world of cyber attacks, right? Which maps out the flow of a given cyber attack of planning, reconnaissance, and so on, right? All that fun stuff. There's a similar flow, if you will, for any sort of organized or high-level influence operation, right? That's not always the case, by the way. I think we tend to think that these are always planned out, very organized and strenuously done influence operations. In reality, that's not always the case, and they're done by low-level actors. But let's assume for a moment we're discussing about a well-planned operation. That will be the case. When we receive that content that we see by searching our keywords, for the most part, we're catching it at the final end of the stage of dissemination and amplification. Right? Or if we hear about it, or, in the worst case scenario, we hear about a certain narrative from even a third party or see it trending on a given platform, right? Then we go look for it. That means it's already been fully successful and we're catching it at the latest possible stage. Whereas when we go earlier up into the stage of trying to find the initial seeding accounts, right? Those that actually are the first accounts to bring the narratives online by finding vetted entities, we're not going to the origin of the stage because we're not going to listen into what's happening in a given office in Hong Kong or whatever happens to be, right? But we are catching it at an earlier stage, and we can then prepare accordingly our remediation efforts.
Interesting. So I think it's for those who are listening who may be kind of introduced to this topic, I think what you've created here is like a framework of thinking about the content, but also as well what happens before the content. And so you're saying it's important to monitor the content. It's important to see what content's going out. It's important to see how that's being disseminated and who's engaging with that. But actually there's a stage, and a very important stage beforehand, which is what the actors, the networks, and how do you approach that?
Definitely. By the way, today and increasingly in the past several years, the utilization of real people as threat actors has been a very, very common point, very, very common tactic, I should say, or TTP. I don't know if we want to go into the whole discussion of tactics, techniques, and procedures, but we'll keep it simple. The exploitation of real people, real disinformation actors, propagandists, state media journalists, whatever you want to call them at the end of the day, has become an increasing trend. Now, that's because many social media platforms are vulnerable inherently. If you're a real person, you have the right to freedom of speech or expression to a certain degree, right? And many platforms are hesitant and not interested in taking down the accounts of real individuals, especially if they drive a lot of traffic. So that's one of the ways that these platforms can be exploited to a certain degree also by organized influence operations. And those real people will then be amplified by tens, hundreds, thousands, or more in some cases, right? Of throwaway or inauthentic accounts to kind of get the message out inauthentically.
Interesting. And so really it's a focus on networks, right? So you're looking at the connections and the interactions between a number of people, fake and real.
Definitely. I think that we are still, the counter IO or counter disinformation industry is still very much a nascent industry, right? We're young. There are only so many companies out there providing either content moderation services, investigation services, or threat intelligence platforms, right? Cyber as how old, for example? I mean that as a compliment in this case, right?
Coming up to 5 years old, yeah.
Coming to 5 years, still a very young industry, right? And it's still being formatted, it's still being formulated. All the frameworks, all the thought processes, all the procedures, and so on. What happens to be done? We see that with the Disarm Sticks. We see that in other ways. We're still undergoing what the cybersecurity or infosec industry underwent 10, 15 years ago, maybe, and is still to some degree undergoing as well. And I think we're finally reaching the stage of a proactive or an offensive mindset in terms of investigation, right? Where we're beginning to settle the passive defenses and so on, and really beginning to understand about how we can go out and proactively detect, investigate, and remediate to the best of our ability this sort of activity. So the development of a threat intelligence mindset and the utilization of similar tools and techniques taken from CTI or cyber threat intelligence in many ways, I think will be the future of the industry.
Interesting. And for those listening, Disarm and Sticks, these are frameworks that are being created in order to standardize and help the industry generally of how to think about these different techniques and that are taking place and how we describe them and then how we mitigate against them. We'll also include in the show notes links to those to those sites that people can read more if they want to. I want to pick up on something you mentioned before about the exploitation of real people, and I'd love for you to expand on that and give some examples on what that means.
Well, there are countless examples of individuals, be they on any given social media platform. I don't want to blame anyone in particular here, but it's not their fault at the end of the day. I'm sympathetic, to say the least. It's a very complex problem. So I'm not one of those who initially jumps to say, oh, tfu, as they say, and we say in Hebrew, right, for doing this sort of thing. It's a complex issue. Yeah. It's not easy. I can refer to some work. There's some great work done by MeBureau, now Microsoft's DTAC, or Digital Threat Analysis Center, on the Chinese lady influencer, I believe was the way they phrased it. Where I'll send you the article afterwards, Rafi. I think it might be of interest to you. You can see it. Where there are these certain archetypes of individuals utilized by overt propaganda mechanisms, right? State media, that sort of thing, as well as covert operations, right? Information operations, influence operations with, inauthentic or, hidden accounts, whatever you want to call them, right? To promote these people. We see it done, like I said, in China with the Chinese lady influencer. We see it done in Russia. There was a great, you might have seen the TikTok video where it takes all of these Russian influencers saying the exact same thing, layered over each other, right? In this specific case. There are many cases of coordinated activity kind of leaving the inauthentic coordinated realm and moving into the authentic coordinated realm. Everyone to phrase it here in this case. But yes, these people are usually real. They're often online influencers, or they receive a salary from some sort of state media outlet or otherwise go this covert outlet, and they have the ability to really say more outlandish things even, and it's much harder to action them or enforce their activity online in comparison. But for our purposes, they're incredible jumping off points for investigations. And as we find the right individuals, they can be investigated themselves at an individual level. There are people doing this online and exposing them or outing them, whatever you want to call it. And we can also use them as ways to kind of uncover and easily find networks of online activity and then move from there to pivoting and finding further information. May I just further add to that, Rafi, that this leads us to the network analysis point, which I didn't really go deep into the previous question. But the point being is that we need to move from an individual piece of content-based way of investigating to identifying the wider networks, and then via those wider networks, uncovering who's behind this given activity and remediating. At the end of the day, OPSEC or operational security is very difficult, right? And the wider the network and the more you can uncover about a given network, the higher chance you have of there being a breach of OPSEC and therefore being able to attribute the activity to the network. I also just would add that the broader and more diverse networks are, the higher chance you have of finding information as well. For example, if they happen to be centered around a given domain, right, we can utilize technical investigation techniques to map out the network of domains and perhaps find out who's behind the given domain and thus potentially the network as well.
Interesting. So it's essentially there are a series of breadcrumbs. That's kind of how I like to think about it. A series of breadcrumbs, and now you're widening your network, you're widening your analysis in order to be able to uncover all the various different pockets of breadcrumbs in order to give you the most amount of signals and hints and analysis intelligence. But I want to maybe let's allow ourselves to kind of go back. Right, you are an analyst and you are working on behalf of a country or a company, and you have the role of conducting investigations. The topic of this episode is how to conduct an influence operations investigation. How do you begin? Because you've mentioned a few different points, and I presume that it can get quite messy quite quickly. When I say messy, I mean there's lots of different moving parts. What's the kind of best way to start that process, or even to think about starting that process?
I think firstly, it's a great question, Rafi. There's a minimal required level of fundamental understanding required to get into this. And that's why one of the reasons why I enjoy this field so much is that it really fuses together all the various subsets of open source investigation, be it digging through corporate records, be it technical cyber threat intelligence investigations, be it social media, be it breach data, be it whatever you happen to want here. In almost some capacity, it's going to appear in this field, which is why I happen to enjoy it. So we need to have a minimal understanding, right? Geopolitically and linguistically what's happening in the given region or topic we want to investigate, which can only be done by hitting the books, as they say, and reading up a little bit and finding out what's happening, reading media and so on. Acquiring a base level can be done comparatively easily at the end of the day, and that usually isn't the biggest problem. The next is having some sort of minimal technical level of skill, again, can also be acquired and so on. And from there, identifying on a variety of platforms these key entities, confirmed entities, whatever you want to call them. I like to have a mix of overt outlets, covert outlets. When I say outlets, I mean also accounts in this case, right? So you can start off with, say, a given entity's state media, if they happen to have state media, or any known pro-X outlets, whatever happens to be, find out who's sharing them, move from there, and then eventually map out, say, 5, 10, or even 20 confirmed entities that you follow over time. These entities then serve as a springboard both for content, which we can search in of itself, right? Be it a string of text, be it an image or a video, whatever it happens to be, we can search that across the internet and look for signals of coordinated activity. Oftentimes, directly on these accounts themselves, there will be huge or very noticeable signs, for example, of coordinated activity, right? For example, a state media outlet might have 10 posts. 10 of those posts receive 5 likes, 5 comments, or 2 shares, and then boom, one goes viral. Let's say I put that in double quotations for those who are listening to this and not watching, right? And we can see that it's being clearly amplified by an inauthentic network. From there, it's easy to take a sample of those and then pivot and map out the wider network and investigate. So I would say, generally speaking, the jumping off point should always be, not always, but should mostly be, right, these confirmed entities, which we can then use to get keywords and other things and so on, and let the threat actors tell us what to investigate. Once we have that, then it's typical investigation and so on, and open source intelligence, which we can discuss in depth, but it'll take a little bit longer. I just want to go over the attack surface of accounts on various platforms.
Well, I think it's interesting, and the way that you phrase it and frame it in terms of let the actors show you the way, right? Let them show you what they're doing. And I'd imagine the byproduct of that is that whereas some investigations are, okay, we think there is something, now let's go find it. Whereas actually, if your approach is let's let the actors show us, is you have no idea what you're going to be uncovering. I presume that's the case, and also as well, if I could ask a second question, is that, what are those moments, what are those aha moments as an investigator where you say, okay, I found something?
Well, firstly, I mean, we're correct, I would say, fully correct about what you said earlier, is that for the most part, you can't really predict, right? With a few exceptions, you can try to predict, and if you put in a general enough keyword and you look hard enough, you'll eventually find something, right? But that's not really the purpose of what we're trying to do at the end of the day, right? We're trying to act in a more intelligent, targeted fashion, and you really simply cannot predict what the given narrative or claim of the day is going to happen to be. However, as we investigate and track these entities and individuals, we will begin to also build what I call a keyword of confirmed keywords or phrases, right? Unique phrases or content that is only used by a certain specific threat actor, right? I'll give an example from my blog. Recently, a big thing in Chinese propaganda and disinformation narratives has been legalization of cyber threat intelligence reporting from Chinese outlets, right, against the United States, calling the United States a quote unquote empire of hacking. The only organization or people to use that phrase specifically are the Chinese in this case, right? So if you were to look up that specific phrase, you would find indications potentially of Chinese activity online. Now, that's only partial, right? That's not going to cover all their activity online by any means, of course, but it is something that we can habitually research, right, to find more information and more signals, and try to pivot and find other indicative keywords and terms and so on. So that would be the secondary goal, from finding the key entities and constantly working to expand those as your initial sources and so on, letting them tell you what they're saying, picking out the indicative keywords, right, from there, and then you can have really broader and more effective coverage in a comparatively short period of time.
Interesting, and I love the idea that there are certain keywords that are more commonly found amongst certain bad actors, certain compared to others, and that I think really fuses the what you mentioned before about the psychology of the approaching it in terms of thinking about the psychology of bad actors, but also the technical investigation and how you're thinking. Okay, someone once said to me, at the end of the day, attackers, threat actors, they're humans, right? And so they bring with them their personalities that might represent themselves, and they're showing their personalities across different channels that they're using. And so I love the idea that there are certain terms that might reveal themselves because it's like a flawed human aspect of ourselves that you can then jump on and say, okay, we think we're identifying a pattern here.
Definitely. I just add to that first, like you said, put it in what you said in other words, it's useful for attribution, right? If you come across a given entity utilizing a phrase that you've only seen used by a certain threat actor, right, and it's highly indicative and specific, even if you don't know who they're affiliated with, you can assume to a reasonable degree, right, that'll be affiliated with that. It's uncommon to see some of the very specific keywords being reused by other actors. It's not impossible, but it's a very strong indicator at the end of the day. So it can be useful for attribution as well. The way that I would phrase also what you just said is that, like I always say, is that OPSEC is hard, right? People are people at the end of the day with flaws. We're lazy. We have biases. We reuse things, right? Which is a common vulnerability or vector for penetration in the world of InfoSec, right? Be it reusing passwords, reusing other things, and so on. And we see this, by the way, in cyber attacks for attribution, the reuse of IP addresses, the reuse of domains, the reuse of C2 servers, right? That sort of thing. We don't need to go overly technical into that whole sort of thing as well, right? But this is how the industry tracks malign threat actor activity, by the use, or the reuse, I should say, of malware, other IOCs or indicators of compromise, and so on, right? And we can and should adapt a holistic version of that for the IO industry, be it the reuse of certain keywords, the reuses of certain text snippets, right? The reuses of accounts and assets online, and other things as well, other pieces of content.
Amazing. And you mentioned to me once that there is a difference as an investigator. There is a difference between investigation nation states versus people or versus groups. And that, I think, really touches upon it. But maybe you can expand on the approach or the differences that exist between different types of entities.
Definitely. I would say a main difference is the scale, for one thing. And the scale is important because I always say that the larger the scale, the larger the chance of there being an OPSEC breach by the person or organization carrying out the attack. So, for example, some things that are underutilized in the world of IO that I think we could be utilizing more to enhance our investigations is the use of breach data, right? If we happen to have a large number of accounts on a variety of platforms, it's not infeasible, right, or unfeasible to believe, for example, that at one point the passwords or other information, right, for these accounts might have been leaked or breached. This is a common tactic that I use in investigating cyber threats, for example, and their throwaway email addresses. They oftentimes reuse passwords for their various accounts online, right? And you can use that to pivot to find other, say, phishing email addresses or registered domains, if there happens to be, and we can utilize similar techniques as well. So that's one thing that we can do in investigation nation states more. If it's a smaller group, the chance of you finding it is certainly not zero, but it's lower, right? At the end of the day, the tighter and more organized and smaller the scale, the harder it'll be to break the OPSEC in that regard. The other element is that scale requires essentially some sort of automation, or at least minimizing, right, the amount of labor required to actually carry out the operation. If you want to be putting out thousands of posts or messages a day, whatever happens to be, you need to be, right, working in some sort of formulaic automated fashion. Whereas if all you're interested in doing for a certain operation is maintaining a few well-groomed accounts online, you can really take the time to write bespoke content, to do it the right way, to create all of them on appropriate burner infrastructure and so on that isn't really easily trackable. And that makes it quite hard for me to say effectively attribute, say, a loan account.
Ari, I wanted to ask you about tools and the tools that you use as an investigator and how they have evolved or changed over time.
Great question, Rafi. So I'm a small firm, essentially myself and a network of freelancers and partners that I cooperate with, right, to carry out all this investigation. Um, and I use a menagerie, if you will, of open source of open source and affordable tools. Right, I'm not a big believer in CLI or command line interface tools for the most part from GitHub. Many people in the open source industry love those. In my opinion, they can be useful in certain scenarios, but utilizing them is a bit of a pain in the ass. I don't know if I can say that. Also, it's a bit of a pain. Let's say a bit of a I don't know how clean you want to keep this, right? I generally prefer UI-based tools with export features and so on. It's just simply what I prefer. But it's all about having a variety of tools, be it per se email resolution, right? I can recommend a few. Be they Epios is arguably the leader, followed by OSINT Industries and so on, and a few others that are really coming out there. Speaking of, there's a bit of an arms race kind of in the industry now, in the OSINT industry, finally seeing all these smaller shops set up and do these kind of focused, targeted individual things that are useful, like looking up email address, for example, happens to be. So I'm a big fan of that. Username resolution tools are incredibly important. What's my name.app being the most important, and there's some other ones out there as well. And I think what's most interesting, though, leaving that aside, and of course, all the various technical tools that I use for mapping out all infrastructure that are either free or affordable. Shout out to DNSlytics for being very affordable and excellent for what it does. It's a great tool. There are many others as well. It's all about combining, I would say, social media and technical tools in many respects. What I'm particularly excited about for the industry going forward and regarding tooling, right, is the ability for LLMs and AI, right, to democratize, I think, the more technical elements of threat intelligence in this regard, right? Currently, if you want to utilize tools like Census or Shodan, it requires basic knowledge of their syntax and that sort of thing, or even in some advanced cases, scripting or API integration, right? And we're fast reaching the stage in which we have text to X tool, whatever it happens to be, right? And we'll be able to really enable threat or IO investigators who oftentimes aren't overly technical, right? I'm the first to admit it. I hate scripting. I hate writing anything in Python. I don't enjoy it, right? To really make the most out of a variety of tools available and to further kind of expand their toolkit here. So that's what excites me the most. And anybody wants to listen to my tools can reach out. I'll be happy to share a few.
Amazing. And for those who also want to hear more about kind of AI and machine learning, check out episode 2 with Matt Edmondson, who speaks about this topic as well. And that was fascinating. And so let us allow ourselves to gaze forward at what the future holds for the industry of the counter disinformation and counter influence operations industry. And I know you've got a couple of thoughts on that.
I do have a few thoughts. So most of the industry now, without getting into any names here, is essentially focused on two main industries, right? Subsets of the industry, I should say. Content moderation and investigation services. There aren't that many functional platforms out there for full investigation. Most of the functional platforms that exist focus on moderating content that has been flagged as disinformation or misinformation. We don't need to go to the whole MDM dichotomy, or I should say trichotomy here, necessarily. Right? But there aren't really many threat intelligence platforms out there currently that are integrated for the field. And I imagine we'll see more of those exist in the near future as the need becomes increasingly clear. And I also think that as the industry grows and develops, it'll start to consolidate at some point, and we'll see integration of these threat intelligence platforms into wider InfoSec methods. Currently, CISOs are still responsible in some cases at the very least, right, and increasingly responsible for managing these sort of activities as well. There isn't really anybody else in most organizations able to handle them. And many organizations will want to have the in-house tooling and platforms available to investigate themselves and to manage their own remediation efforts, which we can also discuss later on if you're interested. So I think we'll see the integration of tools like the further development of threat intelligence platforms and their integration into a wider holistic network of cognitive defense or online defense, if we want to phrase it, for organizations.
Amazing. And I really kind of thank you for giving us the opportunity to delve into this topic. And I know for some people it will be slightly more technical, but I think talking about the frameworks, the approaches, the ways to think about it, the ways to start, the tools, what the future holds is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, whether it's a state actor, whether it's a group, whether it's an individual, the evolution and levels of sophistication by bad actors is only increasing. And so therefore the tools and solutions and analysts and investigations that we have at our capabilities as a society should only improve as well. And it is that arms race. I think that is a good way of thinking about it. And so thanks for talking us through this incredibly important topic at the kind of coal face of counter influence operations investigations. But before I let you go, I have to ask one more question, which is a question that we ask every single guest that comes on as we conclude the episodes. Is if you could name us one good thing, one bad thing, and one fake thing that you're seeing in the online space today.
Okay, so I'll start off. It's a great question. I'll be honest. This is much harder for me than anything else in the interview. To be entirely frank, so you might need to help guide me here a little bit. I would say the good thing. I'm going to be a little contrarian here and say AI music. I'm going to state that the AI music that I have heard from most of these artists being released currently is in many times better than the things that I've heard these artists release themselves. So anything that kind of gives them the ability to, I'm sure you've heard the AI Drake videos now online. That was kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
Right, all these things. I'm not a big Drake fan or anything, but I mean, the AI songs are much better than whatever he's put out in the past. And he's put out some great stuff, I'm sure. Not trying to be offensive, but I enjoy the AI art element of it, and I'm excited to see where that really takes us culturally, right? In the future, democratizing certain elements of art and music curation and so on, whatever happens to be, video games, general art. It'll be interesting to see how we hash out these legal issues kind of behind it as well, but I'm curious to see where that goes. The fake I'll start off with also, which has been a Russian information operation that was exposed by Meta and some other researchers about half a year ago and is still ongoing. France recently had to denigrate it, or not denigrate it, or condemn it publicly. And most fascinatingly, and I've written about this on my blog recently, it's been quite active in Israel, which I think is also the bad thing that I would bring up over here, that Israel has become in many ways an IO battleground recently, perhaps because of the backdrop of this wider political unrest that we've been having, without delving into my personal opinions of the topic, right? But we have seen a notable uptick in Russian and even Iranian activity in the country, utilizing WhatsApp, Telegram, and other platforms as well, including Facebook and Twitter. So that's what I would say would be the fake and the bad, the fake being the Russian operation, which is overtly fake, and the bad being the more the general trend of things, of the ability of IO to really exploit this sort of thing, and in some cases to lead to real world action, as has happened here. So that's what I would say.
Fantastic. Ari, thank you very much for taking the time to talk through that with me. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. So yeah, have a great rest of the day. And for everyone listening and watching, thanks for joining. Until next time.